On the night of April 16, 1848, Easter Sunday, the plantation of Colonel James Whitfield in southern Georgia burned to the ground with him still inside. His killer was not a raiding militia or rival planter. It was a woman they called Mary, enslaved since birth, who set the house alight and watched it collapse with her master trapped within. The Whitfield plantation was a kingdom of rot disguised as prosperity. Cypress beams soaked with decades of blood stood over fields of cane and cotton. The air stank of sweat, dung, and iron, and the barracks whispered with coughs, chains, and night terrors. In the kitchen, where Mary worked, the walls sweated grease and smoke, holding the memory of every scream swallowed so the master could eat in peace. Mary was 30, her back thick with scars from the overseer's lash, her wrists calloused from years at the stove. She had once been forced to stand in the parlor, bare and trembling, while Whitfield auctioned off her infant son to pay a gambling debt. The child was taken before she heard his first words. That theft hollowed her, but it was Easter morning of 1848 that changed her eyes forever. Whitfield, drunk on rum and piety, dragged a young girl from the quarters into the big house. By dawn, the child stumbled out broken, her dress torn. Mary carried her back to the quarters, laid her on a straw pallet, and sat beside her until the girl stopped crying. Something in Mary hardened then, her silence cracked. That evening, while the masters planned their holiday feast, Mary slipped among the other enslaved in the shadows. Whispers carried low and trembling, not from fear but from the weight of what was forming. Ezekiel, an old field hand who still remembered the chants of his people, said he had dreamt of fire rising from the earth. Ruth, who had lost 2 sons to fever in the rice swamps, pressed a sharpened hoe into Mary's hand. A boy barely 12 claimed he heard the dead mutter in the cane that night, blood for blood. The plan grew in fragments. Knives hidden beneath bread baskets, bundles of dry cane stacked at the rear porch waiting for a spark, a jar of lamp oil stolen from the overseer's shed. The big house would become a tomb, and Whitfield would be buried in it. When night fell, Easter hymns floated from the parlor, songs of resurrection sung by men who fed on chains. Mary moved among the tables, silent, her hands steady. She poured wine, laid platters of meat, and slipped a rag soaked in oil into the hearth's embers. Flames caught slow, then faster, crawling up the drapes. Whitfield laughed, raising his cup, until the smoke thickened and the room trembled. By the time the first scream broke, the doors had been barred from the outside. Whitfield staggered to the window, coughing, his face red with terror. For a moment, his eyes met Mary's through the smoke and glass. She did not move. She did not look away. The roof gave first, timbers collapsing like judgment. His cries drowned in the roar of the fire. Outside, the enslaved watched in silence. The sky above Georgia glowed red, and the smell of burning flesh mixed with magnolia blossoms. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Men held their breath as if the flames themselves were holy. In that moment, Mary was no longer a cook, no longer a servant. She was a verdict. This was the beginning, not the end. The Whitfield estate, once a fortress of order, was ash before dawn. Soldiers would come, blood would follow, and many would die or scatter into swamps and pine woods. But the land remembered that night. Easter, the day of resurrection, had become the night of reckoning, and Mary's fire burned in the stories carried long after her name was struck from ledgers. The fire that swallowed Colonel Whitfield was not born in a single night. It was prepared in silence, built stroke by stroke, wound by wound, over months. To understand the Easter blaze, you must step into the suffocating weeks before it, when Mary of Georgia turned from endurance to vengeance. The Whitfield plantation, spring of 1848, the air was heavy with the damp rot of cane fields, buzzing with mosquitoes that fed on blood without asking whose it was. The big house stood swollen with wealth, its whitewashed walls hiding stains that soap could never scour. Every plank creaked with history, every nail drove deeper into flesh unseen. In the slave quarters, damp straw stank of mildew, and the air clung with sweat. Children whimpered in sleep, mothers pressed rags against fevered foreheads, and men whispered curses into the dirt floor where no one could hear them. Mary lived at the center of this furnace. The kitchen was her cage. Iron pots hissed with fat, knives scraped bone, and smoke clung to her skin like a second garment. For 20 years she had served Whitfield and his family, watching them feast while she and the others licked grease from cracked fingers. She knew the weight of every plate, the clink of every glass, the way Whitfield chewed when drunk, the way his eyes wandered toward the youngest girls when the lamps burned low. The kitchen gave her knowledge, and knowledge, sharper than steel, became her weapon. Her wound was old, her son taken and sold south, his name erased, but what hardened her heart was not the theft of her child, it was the breaking of others. In March of that year, Whitfield's overseer, Briggs, caught a boy stealing a heel of bread. He dragged him to the whipping post, stripped him bare, and lashed him until his back was a map of rivers. Mary, ordered to bring water, stood and watched as the boy's mother begged on her knees. Whitfield, drunk on port, laughed and ordered the lash to fall again, saying bread must be paid in blood. That night, the boy died. His mother wailed until her voice broke into silence. Mary did not cry. She pressed the bloodied rag to her face and inhaled until the scent burned into her lungs. From that moment, her eyes no longer looked at the ground. Whispers began soon after. It started with Ezekiel, the old one, who had once carried chains from the coast. His back bent like the cane, but his voice carried an ancient certainty. He told Mary, "The earth will not hold this pain forever. One day it will spit fire." Ruth, the midwife, who had buried more children than she had birthed, leaned close and said, "Maybe it spits through us." At night in the quarters, when the air was thick with coughs and the sound of chains shifting in dreams, they began to plan. It was not a council, not at first, just broken souls speaking what had always been forbidden. But soon, the talk shaped itself into a design. Ezekiel marked the earth with a stick, drawing the big house, the sheds, the gates. Ruth whispered of herbs she kept hidden in cloth bundles, powders that could slow a man's blood or stop his heart. Mary, silent until then, spoke. Fire. Her voice was flat, not raised, not trembling. "He took my son. He breaks our children. He drinks while we bleed. Fire is the only word he will understand." The others listened. Fire was dangerous. Fire spread without loyalty. But fire was also cleansing. It left nothing behind but ash, and ash could not be whipped. Ezekiel nodded slowly. "If fire comes on the holy night, they will think the sky itself judged them." From then on, the conspiracy grew like roots beneath soil. By day, they bent their backs, gathered cane, stirred pots, bowed their heads. By night, they sharpened hoes until the metal whispered. They tucked stones into rags to swing like hammers. They gathered dry kindling under pretense of fuel. Ruth taught the younger ones which plants to chew for courage, which leaves to rub into cuts so they would not fester. A boy named Caleb slipped keys from the overseer's table, copying their shape in clay before placing them back. A girl no older than 12 hid a jar of lamp oil under her pallet. And there was the prophecy. Mora, half blind and near 60, claimed she dreamt of flames licking the sky while chains broke in the fields. She said a voice told her, "The lamb will rise on Easter." To the slaves, it was more than words. It was a sign. Mary carried it like scripture. Her silence, once a shield, became the mask of a soldier. Her hands, once trembling from exhaustion, grew steady. She stirred Whitfield's stews, laid meat upon his silver plates, and in her mind saw his flesh burning on the hearth. The final weeks were heavy with waiting. The masters spoke of Easter feasts, of sermons and wine, of blessings. The enslaved spoke of thunder. Each night when the fields slept, they gathered near the cemetery, where unmarked graves swelled the earth. There they swore oaths not with ink but with blood, pricking their fingers and pressing them into the soil. "If I fall," Ezekiel said, "the fire will rise through another." And Mary, she said nothing. She only stared at the big house, its windows glowing like eyes. She knew when the night came, it would not be only Whitfield who burned. It would be the years themselves, the chains, the silence, the stolen children. Easter was no longer resurrection. It was judgment. Blood had to be spilled before the fire could come. The weeks before Easter 1848 became a season of quiet deaths, each one sharpening the blade of revolt. Mary of Georgia was no longer a cook in the Whitfield kitchen. She had become the keeper of a list, a ledger of torment, and one by one the names upon it were crossed out. The first to fall was Overseer Briggs. His whip had carved half the scars on the backs of the people in the quarters. He had broken a boy for stealing bread, and he liked to boast that he could hear a spine crack from 10 paces. Briggs thought himself untouchable, a god with leather in his hands. But even gods bleed. One dusk, he stumbled to the tool shed, drunk from Whitfield's rum, his boots dragging through the mud. Ezekiel and 2 others were waiting. They had hidden in the dark, their hands gripping hoes ground sharp against stone. Briggs opened the door and muttered something about lazy blacks. That was the last sound he made. A blow split his skull. His body convulsed once, twice, then sagged like a sack of grain. They dragged him to the hog pen. By morning there was nothing left but bones, chewed clean. When Whitfield asked where Briggs had gone, Mary served his breakfast and replied in a voice flat as iron, "Perhaps the hogs know, sir." The next was Simon, the night guard. He had the habit of creeping into the women's quarters when the moon was high. For years, screams were muffled by rags stuffed into mouths, and he walked away smirking. But one night, as he slithered through the door, Ruth was waiting with a bundle of herbs ground fine into powder. She blew it into his face. Simon coughed, stumbled, clawed at his eyes. Mary stepped from the shadows with the same iron poker she used at the hearth. She swung once. The crack of bone echoed through the barracks. Simon's body twitched, his blood seeping into the dirt floor that had drunk so much before. The others buried him under the outhouse. No one searched for him. A guard disappearing was nothing to the masters. Another would always come. With each killing, fear among the enslaved lessened. Whispers grew stronger. Men who once lowered their eyes now met Mary's gaze with fire. Women who had endured in silence now pressed knives into cloth belts, ready. Children watched and learned that their parents were not only bent backs, they were storms waiting to break. Then came the poisoning. Whitfield's nephew, Henry, a soft-faced young man who prided himself on discipline, often forced the younger slaves to stand naked before him while he mocked their bodies. He would laugh and say he was teaching them shame. Mary waited on him at dinner. Into his wine she poured a tincture Ruth had prepared, drawn from bitter roots that slowed the blood and stopped the breath. He drank deep, smiling at her, never knowing that death sat at the bottom of his cup. Hours later, he staggered, clutching his belly. His screams rattled through the halls of the big house as foam bubbled from his lips. Whitfield called for a doctor, but no medicine could cure what the earth itself had commanded. By dawn, Henry was still. His eyes were glass, his hands curled as if reaching for forgiveness. None came. The pattern of deaths spread like a fever. A stable hand loyal to Whitfield was found trampled under horses. Though the reins had been cut, another overseer collapsed in the fields, his face purple from a rope hidden among the cane. To the masters, it seemed like accident, bad luck, sickness. But to the enslaved, it was scripture. The land is answering. At night, the conspirators gathered in the cemetery. Mora, the blind woman, spoke of her dreams, flames eating wood, chains falling silent. She said she heard the ancestors whisper. Soon, every killing was not only revenge, but a sacrifice to feed the fire to come. Mary stood silent in these meetings, but her silence carried weight. The others looked at her as if she had already been chosen by something greater. And yet the danger pressed close. Whitfield, uneasy at the string of misfortunes, grew paranoid. He ordered new locks on the doors, carried pistols on his belt, and threatened to whip anyone who even looked at him too long. At meals, he muttered that the devil himself had come to Georgia. He ordered the quarters searched for charms, knives, or powders. Twice they found nothing. The conspirators buried their tools deep, beneath graves, beneath swamps, in places where only the earth could keep secrets. The tension thickened. Every day of survival was a miracle. Every night another step toward judgment. And Easter drew nearer. The plan was set. On Easter Sunday, when the masters feasted in the big house and the night filled with hymns, Mary would strike the match. The dry cane stacked behind the house would blaze like tinder. The doors barred from the outside. Whitfield would burn in the same halls where he had drunk and laughed and taken what was never his. And the others, they would either die in flames with him or rise from the ashes free. Mary slept little. When she closed her eyes, she saw her child's face blurred by memory, carried off into the world of the lost. She saw Briggs's skull split open, Simon's body twitching, Henry's foaming mouth. She heard Mora's voice, "The lamb will rise on Easter." She whispered it to herself, over and over, until it became more than words. It became breath. The killing had begun. The fire was waiting. Easter Sunday, April 16th, 1848. Georgia's air was thick with heat, though spring was barely born, and on the Whitfield plantation, a feast was being prepared to honor the resurrection of Christ. But resurrection that night would come not in hymns or prayer. It would rise in smoke, blood, and fire. The day began deceptively calm. In the fields, bent backs moved through rows of cane while birds shrieked overhead. In the kitchen, Mary's hands chopped, stirred, and salted as if nothing stirred beneath her skin. She served Whitfield and his guests with the same silence she had always shown. But inside her mind, every motion was a countdown, every plate a step closer to the end. Whitfield, bloated from wine and boasting, strutted through the house in cream linen. He had invited neighbors and overseers to dine, to drink, to remind them that his rule was untouched despite the recent accidents. He laughed that Briggs had run off, cursed that his nephew Henry had died weak in the blood, and promised he would not be shaken. "I own this soil," he declared, raising his glass. "I own the hands that till it, nothing changes that." But outside, change gathered like storm clouds. The enslaved moved with unusual quiet, each of them carrying secrets stitched under rags and hidden in palms. Ruth carried a small pouch of powder in case she needed to finish what fire could not. Ezekiel leaned on his cane, though the wood hit a sharpened iron spike. Children darted between chores with bundles of dry cane, stacking them near the porch under the pretense of kindling. No one questioned it. It was Easter. Fire for the hearth was expected. As the sun sank, the feast began. The big house glowed with candlelight. Roast meat steamed on silver platters. Wine glasses clinked. Hymns swelled. Laughter rose like a challenge to the darkness outside. The masters sang of Christ risen, of victory over death, never knowing death was listening in the walls. Mary moved among them like a shadow. She poured wine, adjusted dishes, bent her head, but her eyes never wavered. At her waist, hidden in her apron, was the rag soaked in lamp oil. In her chest burned the memory of her son's face, gone forever, and the screams of the girl Whitfield had dragged into the parlor weeks before. When the candles flickered low, she moved to the hearth. With a calmness that looked like obedience, she pressed the oil-soaked rag deep into the embers. It hissed, caught, and flared. Flames licked up the drapes. The heat swelled. Within seconds, the room filled with smoke. At first, the masters laughed, thinking the fire a careless spark. Whitfield barked at her to smother it. But Mary stepped back. She did not move for the water bucket. She walked to the door, turned the iron key she had stolen days before, and locked it from the outside. Then she slid the heavy bar across. Inside, Whitfield's voice cracked from command to panic. "Open this door," he screamed, pounding the wood. Behind him, guests coughed as smoke rolled upward. Wine spilled, chairs toppled, hands clawed at windows sealed shut with nails driven days earlier by Caleb, the boy who had practiced in silence until he could do it unseen. The fire spread fast. Drapes roared like torches, beams cracked, and the air filled with the sharp stench of burning flesh and hair. Some tried to smash through the shutters, but Ezekiel and 2 others stood waiting outside with axes. Each time wood splintered, an axe fell, driving nails deeper. Inside, the screaming grew animal, high-pitched and ragged, until it was impossible to tell prayer from agony. Whitfield himself appeared at the upstairs window, face red, hair wild. He shouted Mary's name, not in command but in disbelief. "You," he choked, his voice breaking. "After all the rest drowned in smoke." His face vanished behind flames. The roof gave way first. It collapsed inward with a sound like thunder, burying table, guests and master alike. Sparks shot into the night sky. The house was no longer a house, it was a pyre. Around the blaze, the enslaved gathered in silence. Mothers clutched children close. Men stood with arms folded, their eyes reflecting fire. No one sang, no one prayed. The only sound was the crackling of timbers and the shrieks fading inside. When the final scream ended, the night was heavier than before, but it was free of one voice, the voice of Whitfield. Mary did not weep. She stood at the front of the crowd, her face lit orange, her eyes dark. She had not just killed a man, she had ended an order. She had spoken for the countless whose graves lay nameless in the soil. The fields beyond caught fire next. Dry cane burned fast, roaring with a fury that seemed to come from the ground itself. Smoke rolled across the sky until stars disappeared. The plantation, the symbol of Whitfield's dominion, was undone in a single night. For hours the fire raged, painting the heavens red. Some whispered it was the blood of Christ reborn. Others said it was the ancestors taking back what had been stolen. To Mary it was both. It was judgment and release. By dawn there was nothing left of the big house but blackened stone and ash. Whitfield's body was never found whole, only fragments among the rubble. And yet silence did not mean safety. The enslaved knew soldiers would come. Neighboring planters would not let this act go unanswered. Easter had given them vengeance. The next days would demand survival. Dawn after the fire was not triumph, it was the beginning of the reckoning. The Whitfield plantation lay in ruins, black smoke curling into the pale Easter sky. The fields smoldered. The big house was nothing but skeletal stone and charred beams, and the stench of burned flesh clung to the air. For the enslaved, that morning was the first without a master's command. But freedom bought with fire carried a price that was already on its way. News of the inferno spread before the ashes cooled. By noon, riders from neighboring estates galloped down the red dirt roads. They saw the smoke, smelled the ruin, and knew at once it was rebellion. To them, Whitfield's death was not tragedy, it was contagion. If one plantation burned, others could follow. They would make an example. By the second night, soldiers rode in, militia from the county, muskets slung across their saddles, dogs foaming at the bit. They found the slaves gathered in the quarters, too weary to scatter, too stunned to flee. The men were bound, the women whipped, the children dragged screaming. They beat Ezekiel until his cane snapped across his back. They forced Ruth to her knees, calling her a witch. They pressed Mary against the dirt, pistols leveled at her skull, yet the earth itself seemed to protect her. The soldiers debated. Some demanded her immediate hanging. Others argued she should be taken alive to testify, to expose the conspiracy. In the end, they dragged her and a handful of others to the county jail, iron chains biting into their wrists. The rest were left behind, some executed on the spot, others scattered into the swamps. Those who fled carried the fire with them. Caleb, the boy who had nailed the shutters, vanished into the marshes. For weeks, hunters claimed to hear him in the cypress groves, his footsteps ghosting through the water, a knife flashing like lightning. Ruth was said to have been shot crossing a creek, her body swept downstream. Ezekiel's fate was crueler, hanged from an oak, his corpse left swinging as a warning. But at night, the enslaved whispered his name as if he still walked the fields. Mary's trial was swift. White men filled the courthouse, their faces twisted with fear and rage. They read her crimes: arson, murder, rebellion. Witnesses spoke of her silence, her strange calm, the way she had looked Whitfield in the eyes as the fire rose. To them it was not only defiance, it was witchcraft, blasphemy. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she raised her head and answered with only one word: judgment. The crowd shuddered. Some spat. Others swore they saw her eyes burn like coals. She was sentenced to death by hanging, but legend says the rope never held her. On the day of execution, April 28th, a storm rolled across Georgia. Thunder cracked as she was led to the gallows. Rain pelted the crowd. Lightning struck the courthouse roof, and the earth shook under their feet. When the noose was placed around her neck, the rope snapped before the trapdoor could fall. Panic swept the square. The soldiers fumbled. The crowd screamed. In the chaos, some claimed she vanished, slipped into the storm, swallowed by rain and thunder. Whether she died that day or fled into the swamps will never be known. The records call her executed, but in the quarters, among the enslaved, another story grew. They said Mary did not hang. They said the earth took her back, just as it had taken the blood, the chains, the screams. In whispers, her name became a weapon.
In the months that followed, patrols scoured the woods, hunting fugitives. Fires broke out on 2 other plantations. A barn in Alabama burned under suspicious hands. A cane field in Florida went up like tinder. Each time, planters muttered, "It's Mary's fire." Children born in the swamps were told to listen for her footsteps. Light as smoke, hard as iron. For the masters, the lesson was terror. They built taller fences, posted more guards, outlawed gatherings at night. They forbade singing, drumming, even prayer in the quarters, fearing rebellion might hide in every sound. But still the whispers spread. Easter became a cursed word among them. They did not speak it without remembering Georgia's blaze. For the enslaved, the lesson was different. They had seen one of their own strike down a master, burn his house, erase his name from the earth. Even if Mary was gone, the fire she lit burned on in their minds. Every lash, every chain, every stolen child could end in smoke. They began to believe that vengeance was not only possible, it was inevitable. By the end of that year, the Whitfield plantation was abandoned. The land lay barren, the ruins overgrown with weeds. Travelers swore the soil was cursed. They said no crops would take root there, that the ground itself rejected the seed. And at night, when the wind moved through the cane fields, some claimed it carried the scent of smoke, the faint cry of a man begging through fire. But the enslaved who passed by told a different tale. They said if you stood on the blackened ground and listened close, you could hear a woman's voice, calm and steady, whispering, "Judgment." The years after Easter 1848 did not bury Mary of Georgia, they transformed her. History tried to erase her with a single line in county records: executed for arson and murder. But in the quarters, in the swamps, in the fields where chains still rattled, her name was not erased. It was whispered, carried, reshaped into legend. Children born after the fire grew up with stories of her. Old women told them how Mary set the house ablaze with nothing but her will and a scrap of oil-soaked cloth. Men swore they had seen her on the gallows, rope snapping as thunder cracked, her body swallowed by storm. Some said she walked into the swamps that day and never came out. Others claimed the fire itself carried her away. No matter the version, the truth was the same. Mary did not die. She became something larger. Among the enslaved, her fire was memory turned into weapon. On plantations miles away, mothers soothed crying children by whispering, "Hush, Mary watches, Mary waits." In the hush of the night, when overseers slept, conspirators spoke her name as a signal. Mary was the word for rebellion, the word for vengeance. Planters feared it too. They wrote to one another in tight, nervous script, "Beware the whispers of the firewoman."
Some banned Easter feasts, terrified that the holiday would bring more uprisings. Others doubled patrols, searching cabins for tinder, knives, or charms. But the more they tried to silence her, the more her presence spread. Legend said she walked the swamps barefoot, her body lit faintly by embers that never died. Hunters claimed their dogs would not chase her, whining and retreating into the brush. One overseer swore he saw her reflection in a creek, eyes glowing red, face calm as stone before his horse threw him and broke his spine. When he died weeks later, the people said, Mary took him. But the legend was not only fear, it was hope. In secret gatherings, preachers raised their voices and declared, just as Christ rose on Easter, so did Mary. She rose in fire, to tell us chains can burn. The congregation murmured amen, though no Bible spoke of her. Their Bible was the land itself, and the land remembered. Every rebellion that followed carried a spark of her. In Louisiana, when fields burned, they said Mary's fire had traveled. In South Carolina, when a master was found dead in his bed, the slaves whispered that Mary's hand had guided the blade. Even when no revolt came, her name alone gave courage. A whispered Mary before a whip fell was defiance, even if it was only in the heart. By the time slavery ended, Mary of Georgia had already crossed into myth. Freedmen told their children of her, not as a woman, but as a spirit of judgment. Some swore her fire had cursed the Whitfield land forever. Nothing grew there but weeds, and even birds avoided its charred soil. Others said her voice could be heard on storm nights, whispering through the trees, urging the living never to forget. Yet behind the myth lay the flesh and blood woman, a cook, a mother robbed of her child, a body scarred by years of lashes. She was not born to be a spirit, she was born to endure, and when endurance broke, she chose fire. That choice, made in silence, became the loudest cry the land had ever heard. Today her name is absent from most books. School children are taught of presidents, generals, and planters, not of Mary of Georgia. But in the shadows of history she waits. Every field that once grew cane or cotton remembers her smoke. Every unmarked grave holds her fire. Every whisper of resistance, every step toward freedom carries her breath. Because Mary's story was never about one night or one plantation. It was about a truth that slavery tried to bury, that no chain is eternal, no whip is infinite, no master beyond the reach of justice. Her fire was proof, and so the legend lives. In Georgia, some say that if you walk past the ruins of the Whitfield estate on Easter night, the air will shift. You will smell smoke, though no fire burns. You will hear chains clinking, though no one is there. And if you are silent, you may hear her voice, calm, steady, eternal, whispering the words she spoke at her trial, judgment,